speaking about is really today, not tomorrow. Tomorrow there's an enormous breadth of exciting opportunities, and you've heard about that earlier today and yesterday. But let's have a look at what farming is today, because we're talking about NBN today, this week, next week and next year. And I think the challenges and opportunities that the farming sector face in relation to a national broadband network, a high-speed internet, pretty well should be predicated on what our sector looks like today and what it will look like in the near future. If you consider that up until about 15 years ago, and I'll use a wheat growing farm as an example, you know, when you're looking at the productivity of a farm, you really had the grain going into the silos and the weighbridge data as your main indicator of your production performance. For example, this is a farm just down in the Riverina, which over the decade of the 90s averaged about 3 tonnes per hectare for that particular farm. In the mid-90s, of course, we had the introduction of accessible and low-cost global positioning systems technology, and this is where really precision agriculture had its birth. The notion that you could measure and map things at a sub-paddock scale. And with the advent of low-cost GPSs in the mid-90s, we saw the appearance of onboard harvester yield monitors. So literally as a harvester's moving up and down harvesting the grain, every second the instantaneous weight of the grain or the deflection force of grain on the plate within the harvester was recorded and calibrated to grain yield, and that was recorded alongside the GPS record. So when you look at that decade or the latter half of that decade's worth of yield in terms of yield maps, whilst we had 4 tonnes per hectare average, there are areas of a field that are considerably higher than that in terms of its yield and areas of a field which are considerably lower. And with that sort of technology, I think farmers started to see the true value of data and information in terms of their production systems and how that could be used to inform their management. And of course, since then, we see now the emergence of technology, such as being used by this particular grower in Gilgandra, just up the road, whereby a little optical sensor, handheld sensor, you can wave it over an emergent crop, and it can be calibrated to nitrogen response. And with this information, you can again measure and map the potential nitrogen response of that field. And in this particular case, you know, more than a half of that field would not respond to a subsequent second application of nitrogen. In the scenario where you would have a split application, you'd put a little on up front and you'd save the rest to see how the crop is growing. This technology is now here and available to farmers. Again, this is an example of very important intelligence in data form that a farmer could use to save or to reduce their inputs, in this particular case nitrogen in the second application. In more recent times, we've now seen the emergence of technology aimed at yield monitoring for the livestock sector. Rather than having harvesters with a 9-metre comb on the front, of course, cows are an ideal pasture harvester with about a 2.5-inch comb on the front. And if you take this particular grower that's just located up in my neck of the woods up in the New England, you know, in this particular year, we marched on ahead with an average of 13 DSE, dry stock equivalents per hectare, and that was the set stocking rate for that particular field. If we put collars on those animals and track them around and work out exactly where they're grazing in that field, then we find that some of the effective stocking rate of that field over that particular month-long set stocking interval ranges from 0 stocking rate, there was no grazing activity whatsoever in that field, up to 250 DSE per hectare, and that's extraordinarily high. And what this is allowing us to do and allowing farmers to do, if that technology were made available, would be to effectively get an idea of what their real grazing pressure is, and they could consider, for example, siting strategic water troughs or feed supplements around the field, that particular paddock, to optimise the grazing pressure over the entire field, or put more inputs into those sections of the field that are being grazed more heavily. Again, it's about increasing the production efficiency of their enterprise. So we now have technology, and I'll give you an example, and we saw a flash in the earlier slide, in the earlier presenter of, we're only talking technology now here that's a couple of years off, you know, ear tag tracking technology for animals so that you don't need unwieldy collars like we've been using with some of our growers. We we have technology that should hopefully be available to all growers. It's coming. And I'll come back to that shortly. The reason I've opened my presentation with these examples of precision agriculture is because if you consider what a farm looks like, as in this particular case, this is what a farm actually is. It is an enormously rich source of management information, given the technology that is either here and now or very close to being available to farmers. How does a farmer, on top of the actual physical activity of managing a farm, deal with this information and bring it to bear to optimise production? And that, I think, is the real key question that we've been facing from the perspective of developing technologies since we started in the 90s. And I think the game changer will be the NBN, and I'll come back to that a little later on. So what are the challenges that our farmers face? Let's look at the farming sector now, here and now. Well, we know that it is a challenging workplace, and of course it's a place where we have our families living. It's a very lonely place when you have a problem, because you're generally isolated by large distances from your support network. That could be your mechanics, your vets, your crop, cereal plant pathologists, and obviously your social networks. We know that safety is a big issue on farms. We know that the biggest killers of Australian farmers, which are quad bikes, utilities and drownings, cost our sector $80 million a year in lost productivity. We know that the recent drought, and with a bit of luck we won't be facing another one in the near future, we know the recent drought really highlighted issues around social well-being, farmer depression. What about support networks? What we're able to bring to bear? So we know it is a challenging physical and social workplace to be in. We know now that there is a significant raft of technologies out there that are available to farmers to aid them in improving their production systems, even improving workflow and safety, for example. But often when you purchase technology, there are a lot of hidden smarts behind it. The technology that's available to farmers nowadays is not like the DVD where you can plug it in and it will auto-calibrate auto-set stations and pretty well look after itself. That's the wonderful aspect around things like DVDs. You can put it in and get it to work pretty well on the spot. There are a lot of hidden smarts behind technology that farmers are being exposed to, and in many cases they don't have the technical backgrounds to deal with them. They are an enormously innovative lot, but at the end of the day there are some technology aspects that can simply be lost on them. And I think that's playing a big role in the impediments to adoption of technology in our agricultural sector. We hear a lot about the near-horizon technologies, and UAVs and drones are a classic case. Whenever I talk about precision agriculture, I always quiz, in addition to the virtual fences that my colleagues here from CSIRO can answer, but around the applications and potential of drones. Well, I can tell you now that the most effective use of drones in our sector at the moment is around soil coring, because they are notoriously difficult to operate. If you buy a small one, unless you are really good and you have the mindset to fly these little remote control things, they're not easy things to fly, and let alone to put payloads on them. So they're coming, without a doubt, and they're very exciting, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be up to the mainstream farmers to use them themselves. They're going to need support and support services around using this technology. And of course, as I've mentioned in my earlier slide about the farm being a rich source of intelligence and data, what are we going to do as farmers with all that data? It was interesting, middle of last year in the GRDC, the Grains Research Development Corporation ground cover newsletter, there was a great article in there about a farmer in South Australia who derived enormous value about installing a single soil moisture probe on their farm, just to get an idea of the water underground, useful information when it came to planting sowing, also extra fertiliser applications. No point putting fertiliser out if there's not enough water underfoot for the plant to use that fertiliser. But of course, we're now close to the point where it's not one soil moisture probe that you may have over a farm, because remember, there can be enormous variations in soil types, texture, associated with topography and what you've done to that field. We're now facing the emergence of $100 plus units that you could literally scatter all over your farm to create a living and breathing soil moisture map. There's a wonderful example out there in Texpo. Kerry Thompson and the CSIRO have shown with the smart farm that we're working on. These aren't $100 probes, I might add, but it is very useful as a demonstrator of the potential richness in terms of the volume of data that can be generated and how it can be mapped. Soil moisture across the farm can inform a whole range of decisions, not only just cropping, for example, when to sow, when to top dress, but pasture, and how much legs have you got in your pasture, how long will your pasture continue to grow, when should you move your stock on and off, when can you even move machinery over the ground without irreversibly damaging the soil structure. So we're looking at technology now which can generate a lot of data. And as I mentioned and was mentioned in the earlier speaker's talk, you know, when we see the emergence of a taggle-like technology, you know, we're going to have one of these tags on every animal, or even one on a subset of the animals, for example, the bulls in a herd. At the end of the day, these will be generating positional information every few minutes, especially if you want to fingerprint some behavioural attributes out of that movement data. And I think it's going to generate something like to the power of 131 lots of data for a month of records for a mob of 150 sheep. Who's going to manage and manipulate that? Because at the end of the day, when you look at this technology as a case in point, you may end up with a map with a shotgun splatter of dots, which can be useful for certain things. For example, on my phone, I know where all my cows are at the moment. So rather than having a quick blind drive around the paddock to check my mob before I leave for work in the morning, I can have a quick glimpse to see if they're still there or in which part of the field they're on, where they're grazing. And if I have an animal that I want to check because it may be calving, I can go and find that one. But there are applications far and beyond that, and it's about getting to that struth moment. For example, the way that animal moves around has already been demonstrated that can be linked to, for example, the worm burden in that animal. Can be linked to the imminence of calving or lambing. As mentioned earlier, if you have an animal that flogs off down the road at 60 k's an hour, that's obviously a cause for concern. And so something or someone has to be working on gathering that data and rendering it down to actionable form, to be sent back in a readily digestible format that can be can action a decision, do I act on it now or do I not worry about it? The so-called struth moment. That's what it's going to mean to farmers if it's going to be of any use. So to converge now on that background information and converge it towards the Australians' digital economic future, if you consider that the core, the essence of our digital economic planning is around teleworking, and we see these very ambitious but I think very realistic nonetheless statements around, you know, the proportion of our workforce that we want to have teleworking by 2020. Now, if you consider what is teleworking, well, just to throw up a definition there on the screen, it's about flexible working undertaken outside traditional office environment, work done from a remote location, people conducting tasks from home. Now, does that not sound familiar in the context of farming? Well, of course it does, because that's precisely what farming is. However, you have to bear in mind that if you look at the Australian farmer, they telework in reverse. They're not working remotely from a headquarters and feeding into a larger organisation. They are the organisation surrounded by a network of supporting people. It could be business advisors, it could be a stock and station agent, it could be the person managing your genetics database, your business database, your occupational